So I'm going to talk about forecasting. Big subject. What type of forecasting, you ask? Well, it's forecasting in general, which is good for me because it means that I can talk about any type of forecasting and use that as my illustrative material. I can talk about investment or business or economics or politics or the presidential election, but you've just had lunch. And you probably don't want heavy and controversial now. You want light and entertaining, right? So I'm going to talk about Israeli politics. Light and entertaining, promise. Specifically, I'm going to talk about, really, because that's not light and entertaining enough, the death of Yasser Arafat. Now, I should say as an aside, I gave this talk a couple months ago in Washington. Halfway through the talk, fire alarm goes off. That's the end of the talk. I get an angry email afterward. Why would you use that ridiculous illustration? And I said, you didn't see to the end of the presentation. There's a point. So please, if you're offended, stick with me to the end, then be offended, okay? So, Yasser Arafat. Of course, you'll all recall Yasser Arafat, longtime leader of the PLO, enemy of Israel. In 2004, Yasser Arafat is the head of the Palestinian Authority when he suddenly becomes very ill. He's rushed to a hospital in France where he dies. Immediately, there are rumors and allegations that Israel poisoned Yasser Arafat. What does that mean? Not much. It's the Middle East. There are always rumors and allegations. But a few years later, 2012, scientists tested some of the personal effects of Yasser Arafat, including things like his toothbrush, and they found polonium, radioactive polonium. Aha, the plot thickens. Radioactive polonium happens to be an excellent assassination tool. How do we know this? Because that's what the Russian government used to murder Alexander Litvinenko, allegedly. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Okay, so they found polonium and its personal effects. Well, what's the next step? Obviously, you have to test Yasser Arafat's personal remains for the presence of polonium. Now, at exactly the moment that this little drama is unfolding, the world's largest forecasting research program is underway. That forecasting research program uses real-world forecasting questions. And so the organizers said, hey, here's an opportunity. Let's make this into a forecasting question for our forecasters. And so they asked them this question. There were two teams of scientists involved. One's French, one's Swiss. And they asked them, will either the French or Swiss inquiries find elevated levels of polonium in the remains of Yasser Arafat's body? Now, imagine that you are one of the forecasters answering this question. Can you use arcane math and algorithms, big data in some fashion? No, right? This is not one of those questions. Can you aggregate polls and do a Nate Silver? No, you cannot. What you're going to have to do is look at whatever the available evidence is and form a judgment, which is the sort of subjective decision-making that we have to make all the time. So, how do you go about forecasting a question like this? Well, there's a number of different ways. One way I call the ideologue method. You can probably tell this is not going to end happily. The ideologue method is very, very simple. You have very fixed, very rigid, very passionately felt views, and when you see the question, you immediately know the answer. And in this case, it would result in one variety of ideologue would say, did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? Of course Israel poisoned Yasser Arafat. And then there would be an hour-long harangue about all the sins of Israel, right? Perfect certainty, they know the answer. And that's only one variety of ideologue, of course. They come in all varieties. The other type of ideologue in this question would say, did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? That's ridiculous. Why are you even asking that question? Right? And then an hour-long harangue about all the ways in which Israel has been hard done by. This method doesn't work. Don't do it. Right? No surprise to anybody. You all know, well, slow down, stop, and think. Right? Gather available information, get lots of information, and think about it. Ruminate, stroke your chin, think for a while. And what I've just described is what I call the TV pundit method, right? A TV pundit who approaches this question would know lots about Israeli politics. That's why they're on TV. Give them something to do, right? They actually know stuff. So they know lots about Israeli politics. They know about Yasser Arafat and Ariel Sharon and the Intifada and Mossad, and they know all these things. And if you were to ask them this question, they would stroke their chin, think for a moment, ruminate, and out would come an answer. Where does that answer come from? It comes from their vague general wisdom, right? Now, I wish that I had a clip of TV pundits actually answering this particular question. I don't, unfortunately. However, I do have a completely representative video clip of TV pundits doing their thing. It's from 2008. John McCain has just won the Republican presidential nomination, and he's about to announce who his running mate will be. We all know the answer. Let us see how the wise and informed TV pundits stroke their chins and come up with that answer. How do they do?
False prediction. Whom will McCain pick as his running mate?
Mitt Romney.
Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty.
Charlie Crist, Florida Governor.
Condoleezza Rice.
Buchanan and Wright, it will be Mitt Romney. Happy Mother's Day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I miss John McLaughlin, seriously. This method really doesn't work. It really doesn't work. That's not terribly scientific of me to show you this video clip. What is scientific is the research program undertaken by my co-author on super forecasting, Philip Tetlock. He's a very eminent psychologist, now at the Wharton School. In the late 1980s, he embarked on this huge research program looking at expert political judgment. Huge, ambitious program, took years and years and years, and finally in 2005 he published a book detailing his findings. And guess what? He found that expert political judgment forecasting wasn't very good. Not terribly surprising, right? But there was a finding within that research that most people don't know about, which is actually highly indicative and incredibly important. It was this: there was an inverse correlation between fame and accuracy. Let that sink in for a while. The more famous the expert was, the less accurate his forecasting was, which is really bizarre. So the TV pundit method really doesn't work for coming up with accurate forecasts. But it is pretty good at developing, entertaining forecasts, which is one of the reasons why these folks do so well on TV. And so I'm going to show you another clip for no reason other than the fact that it's entertaining. It's Chris Matthews. In 2013, he's about to tell you who will win the Republican nomination for the presidency in 2016. Watch, you will be amazed.
I predict the hard right is going to take over the Republican Party in 2016, and the nomination is going to Rand Paul. You watch. This is what I do for a living.
What he doesn't tell you is that the ability to make accurate forecasts has absolutely nothing to do with making your living as a TV pundit. Okay, so this brings me, of course, to super forecasting, a third method which I will suggest to you that it actually works. And what do I mean by super forecasting? In order to actually talk about this, I need to back way up. And believe it or not, I actually have to talk about the United States intelligence community. When I talk about the US intelligence community to folks outside Washington, they usually say, do you mean the CIA? And I say, yes, I mean the CIA and the 16 other intelligence agencies, which are collectively known as the intelligence community. All those agencies report up to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence is a very important post, oversees this intelligence community with an annual budget in excess of $50 billion. They use a huge portion of that funding to pay for forecasts about big, important things that really matter, right? It's the forecasting that informs decision-making in the White House. So how good is that forecasting? Answer, they don't know. Lots of people have lots of opinions, but they don't know because it's never been scientifically tested. Is it as good as it could be? Could it be made better? They don't know. They don't know. And fortunately, a few years ago, some officials within the ODNI said, that's not acceptable. We need to do better. And one of the ways in which they sought to do better was they wanted to sponsor a forecasting tournament. Now, when I say tournament, people think it's a game. It's not a game. It's a huge research program. And in this case, what it meant was the officials within the ODNI would go to university-based researchers, the leading researchers in forecasting, and say to them, you create a team to make forecasts. You use any methods you want to make these forecasts, and we will ask you the questions. We will ask you answer these, resolve these forecasting challenges. And so they would be questions which the sort of thing that the intelligence community has to answer all the time. Big important stuff like, will Russia seize the Crimea? What will happen to the Chinese economy in the fourth quarter? So big, important, real-world questions. And so there ended up being 5 university-based research teams in this forecasting tournament. It went on for 4 years. And so that gives you some sense of the scale. But to really get it, picture this. One of those teams, just one of those 5 teams, was something called the Good Judgment Project. And that was headed by my co-author, Philip Tetlock. And the methods that were used by the Good Judgment Project relied primarily upon volunteer forecasters. So they went out into the community, they went to blogs and so on, and they said, hey, do you want to spend a little of your spare time forecasting geopolitical questions? And they signed up a lot of people, and they had these volunteers answer a lot of questions. How many people? Between 2,800 and 3,000 people were involved at any one time. Over the course of the 4 years, more than 20,000 volunteers made forecasts for the Good Judgment Project. So that's a really big, it gives you a sense of the big scale that we're talking about here. So what happens? What's the upshot? The upshot is, of course, the Good Judgment Project wins, hands down, wins by a country mile. Now, there's all sorts of findings that come out of the Good Judgment Project. It's very complex stuff because it is itself an enormous research program. But for our purposes, the single most important finding is this. There was a very small percentage of the people who were making these forecasts who were extremely good forecasters, 1% to 2%, extremely good forecasters, and consistently so. I emphasize consistently, right? Anybody can win the lottery once. Luck, it's pretty awesome. But if you are consistently making accurate forecasts, you're probably looking at skill more than luck. So these people are awesome forecasters. How awesome? Well, at the beginning of this program, the ODNI set benchmarks, performance benchmarks. And the researchers who were involved said, these benchmarks are way too ambitious. Nobody's going to be able to do this. And guess what happened? The super forecasters blew past them. The super forecasters beat prediction markets, something that economists would say is not possible, but they did. And the super forecasters beat the intelligence analysts themselves, the people who had access to the classified information that is produced by all that $50 billion budget. Pretty amazing stuff. So then the question is, how do they do it? So what makes a super forecaster super? Well, here's the first thing. You might think it's because they're super specialized, right? These are people who they're the world's leading experts on whatever the ODNI happen to be asking about. Nope, not true. Not true, and we know that in part because the ODNI asks questions about all sorts of different subjects, some in economics, some in politics, and questions from all over the world. These people were consistently good in all those different domains. These people, in fact, are pretty much ordinary folks. There were dentists, there were investors, there were lots of retirees because they have spare time. In fact, one of the super forecasters I profile in the book, Bill Flack, he lives in a small town in Nebraska. He's semi-retired. He used to work for the Department of Agriculture. His job mainly consisted of putting drainage ditches in the ground. And he's one of the world's greatest geopolitical forecasters. Okay? So it's not specialist knowledge, but I do want to emphasize, these people, they're informed. They're informed people. They're the sorts of people who read the New York Times. They're the sorts of people who follow international news, right? Think about it. They were the sorts of people who were willing to volunteer to use some of their spare time to make geopolitical forecasts. This is not the average person. Okay. The other thing you might think, well, these people are just geniuses, right? They're just so much smarter than everybody else. Well, again, they are smart people. On IQ tests, they score pretty high. They're not just the randomly selected individual taken off the street. But they're not genius level. They're not Einstein level. In fact, the way we put it in the book is basically, if you have the ability to read this book, you probably have the IQ required to do this. And this is another critical point, because this is the era in which we live. If they're fantastic forecasters, they must be using some kind of math that I don't understand. Arcane math, big data, algorithms. No, 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 no. In fact, They are very numerate people. They're well above average in numeracy. But if they use math at all, it tends to be like high school math, that kind of stuff. In fact, there was one super forecaster, I love this guy. He's a math professor at Cornell. Young guy, absolutely brilliant. And when he started doing this, he said, if I do this well, if I really succeed at this, everyone's just going to say, oh, you just did it with math. And so he said, as a ground rule for himself, no math. Okay, so it's not those things. What is it? What sets super forecasters apart? Here's the first one, active open-mindedness. This is a term from psychology. The open-mindedness part is obvious, right? If you're open-minded, it says, I have a viewpoint on this problem, but I want to hear your viewpoint. And I want to hear your viewpoint. Do you have a different method for analyzing this problem? I want to hear that different method. And they're taking all those different methods, all those different perspectives, drawing on them, synthesizing them into their own view. That's open-mindedness. What's the active part? Well, do you know the old saying about open-mindedness? Don't be so open-minded that your brain falls out, right? That's the active part. At the same time that they're going out and consulting these other perspectives, they're thinking about them critically. So you have a perspective on this problem? Okay, that's very interesting. That point you just made, is it supported by evidence? Does it really make sense? Is your logic, does it make sense? They're constantly thinking critically as they're doing all this synthesizing, drawing together these different perspectives and synthesizing them into their own. Now, does that sound like a lot of work? Because it is, right? It's an incredible amount of work. But this is very important. They like thinking. Need for cognition is another term from psychology. It's very simple. Do you enjoy thinking hard? People who score high in need for cognition, they do puzzles for pleasure. The harder the puzzle, the more pleasure it is. These people score really high in need for cognition. They like thinking about hard problems, which keeps them going as they do all this hard mental work. And of course, as you might have guessed, there's an immense amount of intellectual curiosity in these folks. You know, some of the questions that they asked in this tournament were pretty obscure. You know, things like, who will win the presidential election in Ghana, right? If you ask the average person who will win the presidential election in Ghana, they would say, what's Ghana? You know, some might say, where's Ghana? Most would say, why would I care, right? I asked the super forecasters, how do you respond when you get a question like this? One of them just sort of shrugged and said, it's a chance to learn something about Ghana, right? That's intellectual curiosity. I often say, if you're trying to hire forecasters, it's a very simple question I would ask them. I would say to them this, tell me about 3 books that you read that really got you thinking, that were really exciting, and that have absolutely nothing to do with this job, right? An intellectually curious person would answer that question easily, and they would enjoy answering that question. The person who's not so intellectually curious would struggle with it. Desire to practice and improve. Super forecasters believe that forecasting is a skill, and like any skill, it must be practiced. And you must look at the results, and you must learn from the results, and then practice it again, and again, and again, and again. And if you keep doing this, you will get better. To which you might respond, doesn't everybody think that? Isn't that perfectly obvious? In fact, that's not true. There's a psychologist named Carol Dweck who's done wonderful work on what she calls mindsets. There is one mindset called the growth mindset. That's this, the belief that if I work harder, I can improve my skill and get better, right? But there's another type of mindset, and it's the fixed mindset. It's the belief that we are born with certain abilities, talents, skills, and that's it. So if you try and you fail, you're not going to try again. Why? Because you have demonstrated the limits of your skill, and it would be a waste of time to try again. Super forecasters are huge on the growth mindset. And here's another very fundamental one, intellectual humility. Note the emphasis on intellectual. This isn't hand-wringing, I'm not worthy, right? This is intellectual humility, and by that I mean it's kind of like a worldview. It's like they look at reality and they say, you know what? Reality is vast and complex, and we're fallible human beings. For us to understand even a little bit of it is going to take constant struggle. let alone for us to forecast what's to come next, right? And why is that worldview so important? Because if you have that, you know you're going to screw up. You're going to make mistakes. And if you know you're going to make mistakes, you're going to do what? You're going to spend a lot of time looking at your own thinking, trying to spot the mistakes and correct them. And in good forecasters, you always find that quality. My favorite illustration of this is George Soros. You look at his career as an investor, decades of success. And every time George Soros was asked, why are you so good, George? And he was perfectly entitled to say, it's because I'm smarter than you dummies, right? I would have accepted that answer. No, he always says the same thing. I know I'm going to make mistakes, therefore I look at my thinking harder than does the other guy, therefore I'm more likely to catch and correct my mistakes. So that's one consequence. The other consequence of this worldview is this. Certainty is an illusion, right? If the world is vast and complex, we're fallible human beings, certainty is an illusion. Forget certainty, right? Strike it from your vocabulary. Don't go chasing certainty. Forget 100% and 0%. Nothing is certain, nothing is impossible, right? Instead, embrace probability. Everything is a question of 1 to 99%. Now, again, you might think, isn't that kind of common sense? Well, it might be sense, but it's not common. In fact, human beings don't naturally think that way. Human beings naturally think in terms of it is or it isn't, 100% or 0%, or if you absolutely force me, I will acknowledge maybe, and maybe means something around 50%. That's all they do. But these super forecasters embrace probabilistic thinking. They make it habitual. In fact, in one conversation, I asked a super forecaster, just a casual conversation. I said, do you read? Do you read lots? He said, yeah, I read lots. Do you read fiction, nonfiction? He said, yeah, a bit of both. I said, well, what proportion of both? He said 70-30. Then he caught himself and said, no, closer to 65-35, right? That's a habit, and it's a skill that has to be developed. Okay, but so far, I've just told you about traits and qualities. I haven't really told you how they make a forecast. And in order to illustrate that, I need to introduce this gentleman. Anybody recognize him? I think maybe one person in the last 12 months has recognized him, which is really kind of sad. If I showed you a picture of Frank Sinatra, everybody would say, that's Frank Sinatra. This is Enrico Fermi, the great Enrico Fermi, one of the great physicists, and one of the fathers of the atom bomb. Fermi in his lifetime was famous for his ability to make accurate estimates. There would be some problem in science which they couldn't measure. He would make an estimate, then the ability to measure came along, and they discovered, holy cow, that estimate was eerily close. And so Fermi became famous for his ability to estimate, and Fermi taught his method, because he had a method, the Fermi estimate method. And I want to tell you about it because that's basically what super forecasters do. And Fermi, the way he taught his method is very simple. He would start by asking a question which was just a total head scratcher, and here's one of the most famous ones. How many piano tuners are there in Chicago? Go ahead, make an estimate. Now, if you're a student in Fermi's class, and don't forget this is long before smartphones and Google, so don't try that. If you're a student in his class, what do? Well, any human being who looks at this question and says, oh boy, the very first thing they'll do is they'll scratch the back of their head as if that helps. And then they'll roll their eyes a little bit. And then they'll think vaguely about whatever information. They'll think, what's the population of Chicago anyway? How many people really own a piano these days? And then a number will come out. Now, what have I just described? It's basically the TV pundit method, right? Vague rumination on whatever information happens to be available, and somehow a number emerges. And Fermi said, stop doing that. Don't do that. Fermi said, what you want to do is break the problem down. And the way you break the problem down is this. Say, ask yourself in this question, what information would I need in order to be able to calculate exactly how many piano tuners there are in Chicago? Well, if you think that through very quickly, you would immediately, the number of pianos in Chicago, that'd be helpful. Yeah, I'd like to know that. How often are pianos tuned each year? Good. How long does it take to tune a piano anyway? And how many hours a year does the average piano tuner work? And if you think very carefully, you go, yeah, if I had that information, I could calculate how many piano tuners there are in Chicago. And Fermi says, good. And you say, but I don't have that information. You've replaced one thing I don't know with 4 things I don't know. Why is this progress? And Fermi says, stick with it. Keep unpacking the question. So you see that first line, the number of pianos in Chicago? Break that down. What would you need to know in order to be able to calculate the number of pianos in Chicago? Well, the population of Chicago, that would be useful. And the percentage of the population that owns a piano. And of course, there are institutions, schools, concert halls that own pianos. If you have that information, then you could calculate the number of pianos in Chicago. Fermi says, great. And again, you say, super, 3 more things I don't know. Fermi says, keep at it, right? This is a lot of work. You get the hard work theme? You get the hard work theme? Okay, so Fermi says, keep going. Start with that. The population of Chicago. Whoops, how do you break that down? You can't really, right? Either you know the population of Chicago or you don't, okay? At that point, when you hit a brick wall, then Fermi says, guess. Try to be as accurate as possible, as thoughtful as possible. Like, what do you know about Chicago? If you know that it's the 3rd largest city in the United States, oh yeah, that's important. Take that into account. And if you know that Los Angeles' population is X, then take that into account. Try to be as thoughtful as possible, but at this point, you're going to have to make your guess. And then he said, with each of these lines, keep pursuing them, keep unpacking them until you hit that wall, then make your guess. Pack them all back up in the boxes, in the boxes, in the boxes, put it all back together, and there's your final estimate. And you will have an estimate that is far more accurate than if you simply scratch the back of your head. Why does it work? Well, it's very simple. When you scratch the back of your head and vaguely think about information, there's like a jumble of stuff in your brain. There's information, there's beliefs, there's psychological biases, there's goodness knows what in that jumble. Fermi's method forces you to take out a strand of information, a belief, put it on the table. Look at it, ask yourself, does it make sense? Then it forces you to go to the next strand of information or belief, put that on the table. Think about it, does it make sense? And that slow, methodical method results in overlooked considerations being revealed. Mistakes and biases are corrected somewhat. We're human, we're not going to be perfect, but they're corrected somewhat. And assumptions, things that you had just assumed, will be identified. Then you think about them carefully, and when you think about them carefully, you can become a little bit more accurate. Okay, so this method works. So how does a super forecaster use this method to answer my question at the beginning? All right, anybody remember that question, right? Anybody remember the question? Did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? No, that wasn't the question. I pulled a bait and switch on you. This is the question. Will either the French or Swiss inquiries, etc. Why did I pull a bait and switch on you? Because I wanted to illustrate something fundamentally important, and if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this. It's called attribute substitution. That's the psychologist's term. Psychologists have this amazing ability to come up with terms which are totally forgettable. Attribute substitution is a very, very simple but powerful concept. It means this: when we are asked to answer a hard-to-answer question, we will substitute a question which is easy to answer. We will then answer the easy question and feel that we answered the hard question, but we didn't really. We didn't really. And I guarantee you that if you gave most folks this question, most folks would have answered, did Israel poison Yasser Arafat? But that's not the question. It's a related question, but it's not the question. And the key with the super forecasters is they don't fall for attribute substitution. Why? Because they have to unpack the question. And if you unpack the question, you have to look at it really carefully. And then you don't get fooled by attribute substitution. So, let's go back. I mentioned Bill Flack. This is how Bill Flack answered this question. This is a real example. He asked himself, how could it be yes? Right? There's the question. How could we get, what's the pathway to a yes here? And he thought about it carefully. This is how he's going to unpack this question. And he thought about it carefully, and he realized that the very first thing that he had to answer had nothing to do with Israeli politics. Do you know what the very first question is? Scientists must be able to detect polonium in remains 8 years after death. Because if they can't detect it, then the answer is going to be no. All the rest of it doesn't matter. So the very first thing he did was go and research the science of polonium detection. Only when he was satisfied that that was correct, that they could detect it if the polonium was there, did he continue. And then he went on to the next step. So he said, yes, they could detect it. How could we get to a yes? Well, Israel poisoned Yasser Arafat. Yep, that would get you to a yes. But are there other pathways? Yeah, a Palestinian rival could have done it. Another foreign government could have done it. There's a whole bunch of pathways. And here's another one. Someone could have planted the polonium to make it look like he was poisoned, but he wasn't actually. Right? Why do these multiple pathways to yes matter? Because every single pathway necessarily, logically, dictates an increase in the probability of a yes. And that put Bill Flack on course for the correct answer, because the correct answer was yes. One of the two teams did detect polonium. By the way, if you're wondering, observers agree that basically, no, he probably wasn't poisoned. This thing sort of ended in a scientific muddle, okay? But that's why it's so important to focus on the question that's asked, not the other question. Because on the question that was asked, unambiguous correct answer was yes, and Bill Flack was right, and he was right because he approached it this way. So, very quickly, now so far I've talked about individuals, but we don't make forecasts as individuals, right? At a minimum, we talk to other people. Usually we work with other people. So then the question was, well, if we've identified super forecasters and we put them together in a team, will they become super duper forecasters, right? Can we improve their already outstanding results? And so the researchers basically had to ask themselves that question, and they were sort of a bit perplexed because it could go either way, right? Because teams don't always improve performance. Teams sometimes drag down performance, right? Why? Freeloading, right? You're going to go and do that hard work? That's fantastic. I'm going fishing, right? Narrowing of thinking, right? You come up with some new information, a new hypothesis, and we all say, oh, that's fascinating. And then we all go chasing that one. And we ignore the other hypotheses that we would have investigated had we not first heard from you. And excessive confidence. This is the big one. You agree, and you agree, and you agree at a certain level of confidence, and you agree at a certain level of confidence, and we all agree. Guess what happens to our level of confidence? Up it goes, because how can we all be wrong? Right? The very fact that we all agree is proof that we're right. Fantastic. Call it a day. Right? What I've just described is groupthink. Groupthink comes from a 1972 book by Irving Janis. It's the term, he coined the term, and to illustrate it, he used this example. Anybody recognize who these folks are? Give you a clue. They're Cuban soldiers. Anybody? They're really happy. And I'm running out of time, so I better speed this up. They're really happy because they just won the battle at the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an incredibly stupid plan, which they went ahead with anyway because of groupthink. Right? Very smart people in the White House approved this plan even though it was idiotic, and it resulted in a fiasco. So how does teams improve results? There's a division of labor, obviously. There's sharing of information. We now have more information than we would have had otherwise. We test each other's thinking, right? And here is the classic illustration of teams improving thinking. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's JFK and Robert McNamara. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, they did all those good things that teams should do, and they produced good decision-making. How do we know it was good decision-making? Because there wasn't a thermonuclear war, and we're all here, which is very good. So what makes the difference between a team that drags down performance and elevates performance? You might say it's the people. That's what people intuitively think. If you put good people on a team, you'll get a good team. If you put bad people on a team, you'll get a bad team. And that answer is incorrect, false. In fact, here's the punchline. The team that approved the Bay of Pigs invasion was the same team behind the Cuban Missile Crisis, basically the same people. What was the difference? After the Bay of Pigs, they said, we've got to do better. They identified the problem as groupthink. They came up with methods to correct groupthink, and they worked. The result was an excellent group. So, long story short, they put the teams together, the super forecaster teams. They taught them about how to work in groups to avoid groupthink. They taught them these various methods in order to improve performance, to ensure that they're an effective team. They put them on teams, and guess what happened? Fantastic performance. Fantastic performance. Already excellent forecasting became even better. Finally, if some of you are still offended by the example I used from Israeli politics, Why did I use that example? Very simple. It's because you care, right? It's because you have a feeling about it. It's very easy to be analytical, cool, Enrico Fermi style, when you're dealing with a forecasting question that you don't passionately care about, right? If I ask you who's going to win the Best Actor Oscar, you say, I don't care, but I'll do the analysis, right? You can be Vulcan, right? Then you can be Spock. But if I ask you about something you really care about, it's much, much harder. You have to maintain your focus on accuracy. And this is one of the absolutely essential reasons why super forecasters are super, because they have a relentless focus exclusively on accuracy. That is rare. In forecasting, there are always so many other goals, competing goals, distracting you away from accuracy. There are your own feelings. There's the desire to please your boss. There's the desire to please your customer. There's the desire to be entertaining, to attract attention, to avoid attention. All these other goals. But if you want to be an accurate forecaster, you must have one and only one goal: accuracy. Thanks very much.